forward on this. All right, guys. I am hoping that we can be done. I think an hour and 10 minutes should be good for this one. But we'll see. Does anybody urgently have somewhere that they need to be at noon so that I can plan for that ahead of time? All right. Well, let me know if you do. And we will go from here. So, disabilities and access in tutoring. Present. I'm excited about this one because what we're going to be doing is not just, oh, let me give you basic information on these different categories of disability, but we're really going to talk about ways to connect in sessions and ways to adapt your sessions to become more accessible. Give me one moment. Here we go. All right. So, all right. So disabilities and accessibility in tutoring. The goals of this training, apart from that, are going to be, one, really have some solid definitions for disability and learning disability, and also to talk a little about the special ed system and how things work there. Two, I want to provide some starter information on specific disabilities and then neurotypes on the mental side. And three, we're going to talk about accessibility and accommodations in tutoring. And like I said, with special ed, we're also going to talk about the law, because I think it is important to know that part of the context. So here we go. I actually want to temperature check us really quick. And I'd like you, if you know how to react, I think you do because you all raised your hands. I'd like you to sort of rate your experience with this topic. So a thumbs up would be like your experience with this, you've got lived experience, you've discussed it in a lot of detail, and you feel really confident with it. A clap would be that you're sort of experienced or you haven't discussed it in a lot of detail. And a heart would be, this is new to me, I have no idea what this is about, and just limited experience. That way I'm not, talking over you if you've got experience in things that I don't. I'm seeing a lot of claps. Okay. All right, so all claps. So kind of middle of the road. All right. So what I will do is I'd like to lean on you to share your experiences when they come up, and I will work to supplement them with the information that I've got prepared. Alicia, yeah, what's up?
Sorry, I was just trying to load the clap.
Oh, no worries. Okay. Cool. And then just for transparency's sake, I'm going to let you know that in terms of my lived experience, I identify as neurodivergent and somebody who might have been diagnosed with learning disabilities at different times in my life. But I am also able-bodied. So when we talk about things like being able to move around the classroom and stuff, that's not a part of my lived experience. If anyone has experience and wants to correct me on anything or wants more resources, I will do my best to provide those. But I just think that's important because this topic can be very personal for a lot of people. All right. So let's just go with a bird's eye view of disability. In 2019 to 2020, 7.3 million students received services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The reason I mention that is that that's 14% of students, which is 7 out of 50. So if you think about, if you've got a full group of 50, statistically, 7 of them could be students with disabilities. And here we have kind of a breakdown of what students are served age 3 to 21. So as you can see, specific learning disability, and we'll talk about what that means, is the most common. After that, you've got speech and language impairments. After that, you have other health impairment, which includes things like chronic illnesses. It actually includes ADHD. It's not really its own category. And then autism, developmental delay, and so on, all the way down to hearing impairment and orthopedic impairment. And those are like 1% of the students aged 3 to 21. I think it's worth noting that this is not necessarily what's most common. Actually, like when you reach the college level, emotional disturbance becomes one of the most common, but it's what's noticed K through 12. And so when you think about, we're working with elementary schoolers, they're building those basic skills. When you see differences in those basic skills, that may be a learning disability. And so that's what gets noticed, that's what gets tested for, all of that. So that's what we're looking at right here. There are, of course, way more categories of disability. You might notice that like vision impairment didn't even make the list here because it's smaller than 1%. But of course, if you have students who are dealing with something like that, then you want to know how best to support them. My presentation is going to follow the larger categories here. So it's not going to be complete, but it's going to get us started with what's common. So going along with this, let's have some basic definitions. So when I talk about disability, I'm talking about a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. That's the definition according to this IDEA Education Act. And when we talk about learning disability, we're talking about a disorder in one of our psychological processes. So input or perception, the way that their brain organizes information, memory, expressive language, or motor skills, the way that you move, your coordination. Regardless, I think it's important to note this is something that gets diagnosed by a school psychologist, not really by us. And so there's different biases in place that affect who gets these diagnoses. People can be like overdiagnosed, like, oh, you're having these difficulties with reading, so that must be a learning disability, and we got to do all of this stuff and put you in special ed and all of that. But it also can be underdiagnosed, where someone maybe has signs of a learning disability, but or a mental difference, but they are like quote unquote high functioning in other ways, and so they don't get the accommodations that they need. So you can be both like over-resourced and under-resourced with this. And a lot of times it also like ties into things. There are race and gender gaps in this, in terms of white boys being the most likely to get like the amount of resources that they need compared to other groups who may be seen as, oh, you've got behavior problems, or, oh, there's nothing wrong, you just need to try harder. But the point that I want to make is that this is diagnosed by a school psychologist. So any questions or reactions so far as we talk about this and these kind of general definitions? Is there anything that you feel like you would add to these, or things that you're confused about? All right, then I'm going to keep going. So we're going to talk about disability in schools. Like I said, there is some over and under resourcing. But in general, if you are a student who is in special education, there's an IEP, an individualized education plan that is put together by a team. And this would be one of those educational records that a parent needs to consent to give you access to. If a student has an IEP, it includes history of the student and basic information, including like their full support team. So that could be, the school psychologist, the teacher, the parent, and so on. Students with maybe a speech language impairment might have a speech pathologist that they work with. It includes annual goals. It's revisited every year. What are we going to try and accomplish with this student this year? and it includes a list of the aids and services that the student will be provided with. Like I said, it's protected by FERPA like other records, so it's on that need to know basis. I mention this because sometimes you could be one of those supplemental aids. Maybe one of the things in the IEP is student will receive tutoring after school, and then, you know, we're the tutoring program. So you would sort of need to know, okay, what are the goals with this student? And that's that need to know basis. But like I mentioned, with this over and under resourcing, students can have learning difficulties, even if they're not official special ed students. And there are these race and gender gaps in diagnosis due to biases and stereotypes. And also due to, you know, how the student is doing academically. If they're doing well, for example, but they're, you know, they're like still disorganized, they're having trouble with emotions, they're having trouble socially, but they're like, they have good grades, then someone might say, oh, that doesn't qualify for special ed. Oh, we're not going to diagnose you. And those students can actually deal with a lot of challenges later. I speak from experience there as somebody who, like, throughout my life has been told, oh, you know, you probably have ADHD, but then within the school system, they were like, oh, you know, but you're doing well enough that we don't need to give you extra support. And that actually can be really a problem if it turns out, yes, you do need extra support. So we want to kind of be mindful of that. We want to challenge this medical model because it doesn't always lead to people getting support who need it. And that's definitely true of our At Promise youth. So let's keep going. So accommodations don't always get to everyone who needs them. And there are different ways that we try and create more accessibility. So I'm wondering, I know that you all kind of rated your experience as like middle of the road. Has anybody ever heard of the curb cut effect? I'm going to take that as a no. Does anybody know what a curb cut is? I'm seeing a no from Cassandra.
Does it have to do with spacing?
Sort of, yeah. Say more about that.
If I'm thinking about it like an architectural standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's to ensure that there are areas in which people who do not have walking accessible needs can move around.
Yeah. So I'm gonna even expand off of that. So you got this picture right here with a crosswalk. And then to get up on the sidewalk again, you know how it slopes a little bit? It kind of goes up gently like a ramp. That's called a curb cut. And they didn't exist for a long time. The reason that they were developed was specifically to help people who were in wheelchairs. Because, you know, they would need help if they were gonna get up over onto the other edge of the sidewalk. And so the curb cut made a ramp so that they didn't need that extra help. But I want us to think for a minute as we're talking about this, about when you, all of the other people that curb cut can help. And you can see right here, you got someone with a suitcase, you got a little kid with a scooter, maybe you have somebody with chronic pain, or you have a pregnant person who needs a little bit more, who needs it to be a little easier to get up over a curb, family with a stroller, all of this. And the reason I talk about this curb cut effect is not to confuse you. It's actually because we have this, there's this concept as we design things that if you design for the person who needs the most assistance, you end up benefiting everyone. If you make something like so that someone with a wheelchair can get up over it, it helps all these other people, even if they're not in wheelchairs. And so when we talk about kids in school maybe getting treated differently because of special ed, or not getting the resources that they need because of school biases or whatever. But we design for those kids, we end up helping everyone. The same thing is true. I mean, something that I found out very recently as I was doing research for this presentation and trying to find some other examples was that text messaging actually has its origins in helping folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, because, you know, it wouldn't have been possible to communicate by phone the same way. And now text messaging is something that we use all the time. Same thing with closed captioning. How many of you use closed captioning when you're watching stuff on like Netflix? Anyone else? Yeah? Does it help you?
Yeah, I mean, if it's just like loud in the house, or I'm trying to be quiet and I don't want the volume all the way up, then that's when I use it.
Exactly, right? And
Mhm.
like I use it to watch things and understand them. And I also use it to, you know, if I'm talking with a friend during a movie and like, oh my gosh, I don't remember that actor's, I know that actor's face, but not his name. Who is that? You know, we can have that conversation while still enjoying the movie that we're watching. So it's one of those examples where it was developed as an accommodation, but it helps everyone. So as we talk about different learning disabilities and disabilities in general, we're going to talk about it in this curb cut way, where the things that we do to help these students are things that can help all of our students. And the more that we plan for them, the more that we'll be able to engage with our students in the ways that they need. So I think it really ties into a lot of our focus on restorative justice, a lot of our focus on meeting students where they're at, giving support, and definitely help students to build skills after the pandemic. Maybe you have a student who doesn't have like dysgraphia, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but they still need help practicing writing because they've been typing for 2 years. Some of the accommodations that we use might be helpful for that student. I'd like to have a couple of people share out any thoughts or reactions that they have to this concept. I personally thought it was really cool when I first learned about it, and I'm wondering how you all are feeling or how you see it maybe applying in tutoring. Maybe Callan. We'll do Callan and then Cassandra.
It got me thinking about also how straws are used for people of disability, and how like a lot of people are like arguing we should have them removed, and then there are people who are saying we should have more eco-friendly variants
Mm-hmm.
and such like that. So it makes me think about how there's more resources in this world that we have
Mm-hmm.
that we can utilize for our youth who
Mm-hmm.
don't have access to everything. And then it makes me also think about what laws and opinions are preventing us from using those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the laws and opinions part is complicated for sure. But I definitely think that I like that you brought up that point, because I think it also shows how helpful creativity can be, that it's not this binary of straws, no straws, but like, how do we have something that is environmentally friendly and also disability friendly, for example? What does that harmony look like? And I think the same can be true with our students. You know, how do we have something that's engaging and accessible? So I like that you brought that up. And Cassandra.
Yeah, it just also made me think how when the student's having trouble with stuff, or they're not wanting to do something, that is not necessarily because they're being bad or they're being rebellious, but it's because we can never know what disabilities they're carrying, because maybe they themselves don't even know, they're not even diagnosed yet, so how could they tell
Mhm.
us? So that's what it just made me think about, that you know, you need to really treat everyone fairly, because you never know what they could have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Treating them fairly, and then I think also believing them when they're having trouble with something, and not just being like, oh, you already know that. Yeah, I think it really involves both of those things. So appreciate your perspectives. All right, so let's move on. We're going to start talking about these specific categories. And we're going to talk always through this language of universal design about how we help all the students in our classroom by designing for these students. All right, so here we go. So we're going to talk about specific learning disabilities, focusing on dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, which are some of the 3 most common. And I'm wondering, dyslexia is pretty common. It's actually the most common learning disability. Has anyone ever had experiences working with students with dyslexia? Or when I say dyslexia, what comes up for you? What do you already know about this?
Don't some like I don't know exactly if I'm gonna say this right, but do some letters or do the letters look backwards sometimes, or like the words, like they just have a hard time reading it?
Yeah, that's like one of the really common things that people tend to know about it is yeah, that it affects reading in that way. Anything else? Has anyone ever worked with a student with dyslexia? Okay. Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because a lot of times people think that this is a visual thing, like that it's just, oh, the letters move around on the page and we don't really understand why. Dyslexia as a whole makes it hard to work with language. And so the process is, if you think about all of the things that are involved in reading, if just one process kind of isn't coming naturally, that can lead to a huge challenge with reading. So with dyslexia, a lot of the times, the issues are with decoding. So like breaking a word into those smaller pieces. And then also with phonemic awareness. So this letter makes this sound, and they always are paired together. Those processes just, they don't come as naturally. So apart from, someone talking about the letters moving on the page, or, having a hard time keeping track of the words, which is really what's happening, some issues may be, or some things you may notice might be guessing on words, reading the word home rather than house, or skipping little words, things like of and the. And actually the earliest sign that people notice that could be a possibility of dyslexia is not really understanding rhyming words. If I'm going to you and I'm saying, hey, cat and hat rhyme, can you think of any other words that rhyme? And they're not really understanding, the sounds in there, that could be a piece of dyslexia. It also may show up in subjects other than reading. If students are maybe having a hard time keeping track of letters and numbers in math, that could be an example of, or that could be a sign of dyslexia. If they're really, really avoidant about reading, it might be because reading is really difficult for them because one of these processes is not quite solid. So it can show up in these other ways too. The thing that is interesting about this actually is that up until like 2nd grade, 7 or 8 years old, it's actually pretty natural for kids to flip a few letters around here and there, especially for those, our kiddos who are still learning how to write. So that is not necessarily like, oh, if a kid mixes up B and D, you want to work on that, you want to practice it with them, you want to strengthen that phonemic awareness, but it doesn't automatically mean, oh, you've got dyslexia. Has anyone ever heard of dyscalculia or dysgraphia?
No, those are like completely new to me.
Cool. Okay. I love when things are new because that means that we can talk about them together. So dyscalculia is the same sort of it's a specific learning disability, dealing with a specific learning process, but this one would be with math. So number sense, math facts, being able to hold in your head, oh, is 7 bigger than 9? Or 7, is it bigger or smaller than 9? could be examples of dyscalculia. You might also see it in terms of, not really understanding what a plus and a minus mean. These are all kind of, the thing is, these are umbrella terms. It's going to look different in every individual. So when it's affecting reading, it would be dyslexia. If it's a learning disability or a learning process difference affecting math, it'd be dyscalculia. And then dysgraphia would be with writing. So with dyscalculia, number sense, math facts, things like counting money, things like dealing with space and things being bigger or smaller. Some of those math skills are not quite there. They're not going to be automatic. The student's going to need extra support and extra help with those. And then last would be dysgraphia. And that has to do with writing, but it's specifically so writing has a lot of different processes in it, right? Just like reading. It's not just breaking the word down into pieces with reading. It's also comprehension. It's also understanding sounds, all of that. And same with writing. I mean, part of it is organizing ideas. Part of it is knowing what words mean what and how to express them. And then part of it is physically picking up the pen or putting your fingers to the keyboard and transcribing that written language and spelling words and all of that. And that's the piece that dysgraphia refers to. There's actually a different word for if they're having trouble getting their thoughts down. That's like an expressive language disorder. That's not as common. Dysgraphia is physically, am I writing really, really big, or am I having trouble with my spelling to the point that it's just impossible for me to get my words onto the paper? And then same, it's also true of, you could have it for typing. So sometimes that's a coordination thing, developing those motor skills. The process of writing is just, it's going to be more difficult. There are a lot of other specific learning disabilities. There's like a nonverbal learning disability. There are issues with spatial reasoning, all of that. But these are kind of, I would say, the big three that you would see the most often. And students could have traits of these, even if it's not a specific learning disability. For example, like I mentioned, writing can be very, very hard for kids who are used to typing or used to text to speech. And those processes might not be automatic. Any thoughts, comments, reactions? I see Cassandra. Yeah, what's up?
Does stuttering count as a disability?
We'll talk about speech and language impairment later. That can be in, if it's causing significant challenges in life or in school or those things. Yeah, it could count as speech language impairment. But it wouldn't be it wouldn't be one of these. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else? Any thoughts, reactions, surprises with this? I'm so glad that you're learning these, if these are, learning them for the first time, because yeah, there's a lot to this. All right. So we know that these processes are not automatic for these students. How do we work with them? Lots of different ways. So one of the most kind of tried and true methods with these students is called multisensory instruction. And that basically means you're engaging more than one sense at the same time. So, touch and hearing at the same time, tapping something out while talking it through, or visual and feeling, I'm reading a word and I'm also writing it on my desk with shaving cream. We may not have shaving cream, but that's just an example. You're engaging more than one sense at the same time, because the idea is, okay, this isn't as automatic with one part of the brain, but if we use multiple parts of the brain, they'll work together. So that's multisensory instruction. The other thing that is important with these students is to just acknowledge their strengths, even as you're validating frustrations. Reading is really hard to you, or reading is really hard for you. I can tell that you're having trouble with this, and, letting them know the things that you notice that they're good at. Because a lot of times these students, maybe if they were diagnosed early, have just always heard about all of the things that they're having trouble with, and they don't always get as much time to have their strengths appreciated. So you want to acknowledge strengths for all of your students, but especially if you know they have learning disabilities. For dyslexia, some strategies are involve focusing on that phonemic awareness. You know, a D makes a D sound and really getting that solid. And that involves a lot of, you know, sounds and repetition. You can help with spelling or visualizing words with strategies like air writing. You know, use your finger and then draw out the letters in the air and practice them that way. Sometimes I like to do this and ask a student like, okay, what color are you going to write in? And imagine, you know, maybe it's pink or maybe it's green, because it gets that next part of their brain engaged. Same thing, writing on your hand with your finger for spelling words or something may help. And just be aware that sight words are going to take more time and more strategies. I believe the statistic, if I'm remembering this correctly, is that for sight words, it'll take like 14 times for a student with without dyslexia to get a sight word, but it'll take up to 40 times for a student with dyslexia. So they need that, they need more repetition, they need more strategies. Have it be a game. And we do have some sight word games in our curriculum, because that maybe will stick in their brain a little better. It's not going to be automatic, and they need those sight words to move on with their reading, because English is a really frustrating language that does not play by the rules. So you just want to be aware of that. For dyscalculia, a lot of examples focus on making numbers not just something that you hold in your head, but something that's concrete. So drawing out a math problem, or tapping while you count, or using movement and storytelling to develop that number sense. Drawing out a number line and hopping along the number line, different things like that. Because it's like this vague idea of numbers doesn't work. It needs to be concrete. Keep also has a ton of math manipulatives. I worked really hard to sort all of these last summer. We do have them. Things like number cubes, things like, you know, little foam fraction circles and stuff. So if that's something that you need, or you think your students would benefit from, or you have an idea for a lesson that uses those, please reach out to curriculum, coaching, or supervisors so we can get those to you. Lastly, for dysgraphia, like I said, that would be about the written language. And so things that could help would be tracing or drawing exercises to help build motor skills, bold line paper for handwriting so they can see the spaces between the lines. There are little techniques like printing out a what's called a space kid. If you have a student who's like writing words really, really far apart and you want to teach them like the normal way to write words together, you can have a little space kid on a popsicle stick and go word to word. And this could be, since we talk about universal design, multisensory instruction is going to be more interesting to your students. And same thing, if you have students who type more than they write, maybe they do need these practices. Maybe you do want to do some tracing of letters with them. Maybe you do want to use drawing exercises to help them build those skills, because they haven't had as much chance to grow those skills as they would have if they had not been in virtual school, for example. So questions, comments, reactions, because this is the most that we're going to talk about specific learning disabilities. We're going to move on to our next slide in just a minute. All right, I'm going to try something new. I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, and in the chat, let's see, what is our next one? Right, it's ADHD. Okay. So I would like you to share in the chat, 3, 2, 1, what do you associate with ADHD? Ready? Go. When I say that, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? High distraction. All right. Attention span. Nice. Tangent. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, solid. Can't focus on one thing, 100%. So you mentioned a lot of the attention focus. A lot of times when I do this one, people also talk about like very high energy, and like impulsiveness and that. So we'll start with this. Did you know that there's more than one type of ADHD?
No, I didn't know that.
All right. Has anybody ever had experiences working with a student with ADHD or a student that you think has ADHD?
Yeah, I have.
Can you share about what that's like?
Yeah, so at first I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
The student was very like I'd have to like constantly remind the student to sit down or to like not get off their seat, kind of like quiet down because the student was talking a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And once the mom shared with me that the student had ADHD, I was like, dang, like that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I felt bad of all the times that I like constantly like had to remind the student. So after that I was more patient and like
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to understand like the student more better.
Yeah. And what was it like? How was the student in terms of homework or getting things done? Like, what was that process like?
So the student was really good with homework, just that
Mhm.
he would get distracted easily.
Gotcha.
So like, and they were very like, I don't know, the words they said, like, I don't know, maybe it was just a specific student. They knew what they were doing. That
Mm,
just they just would get distracted a lot.
gotcha. So it was more the like impulsiveness and behavior in other areas, and then getting distracted.
Yeah.
Has anyone else worked with students with ADHD? All right. So we're going to start with talking about what ADHD actually is. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is a huge fancy word that you don't need to remember, but it basically means that some of the brain structures in these students take longer to mature, especially when it has to do with executive function. And executive function is like the management system of the brain. So it involves things like memory, organization, planning, decision-making. That's all executive function. And those structures are taking longer to mature. So like I said, we actually have two types of ADHD. It used to be that they were considered separate. You know, we have ADHD and we have ADD, but there's so much overlap between them that now they're just two types of ADHD. So there's the hyperactive type, which a lot of us know. That's the student who's getting out of their chair, that blurts things out, that maybe, you know, is really high energy and really easily distracted. But there is also a type of ADHD. It's called ADHD PI, stands for primarily inattentive. And that student might not be hyperactive the way that we think of ADHD. They might be really quiet. They might be a daydreamer. They might be disorganized and forgetful. And that's still ADHD. And those students oftentimes, in both cases, have trouble expressing themselves, either because, you know, there's so much going on in their head that they need to get out, or, you know, I'm having a hard time identifying what I'm feeling. So those are the two types. It affects a lot of things that aren't attention and aren't hyperactivity. It affects things like memory, cognitive flexibility, the idea that some people can have different points of view and that can be okay. Or, oh, this plan changed and I can be okay with that. Self-control, attention to detail. And then it also has some similarities with autism, which we're going to talk about next, where you can be over or understimulated. Like there's too much happening in my environment and I'm overwhelmed, or there's not enough happening in my environment, so I zone out. And it also has these internal components that we don't always see, where there's trouble with motivation. You know, why do I need to do this? I'm not really, you know, I don't feel fulfilled from doing this, so I'm just not going to do it. And then again, executive function, planning, knowing where to start a task, being able to get started. These students a lot of times can be extra sensitive to rejection, especially if they've dealt with it in the past, or they don't really understand social cues. Because again, those are a detail. Little things like eye contact or body language or tone of voice are details that a student with ADHD might not be processing. And then also, if they don't really know what's going on or why they can't do something, or they've been shamed a lot for not being able to do things, they can feel really helpless. So I want to add that because there is way, way more to this than just attention and hyperactivity. So thoughts, comments, reactions on ADHD, whether this kind of puts some of those things in perspective with students, or if there's anything you didn't know or anything you're curious about. All right, I'm gonna keep going. You can share in the chat if you want to, or raise your hand and I'll keep checking the participants. But let's talk about how to work with these students in ways that will help all of your students. So first thing that you would do, or first thing that can be helpful, if you have a student with ADHD, there's a chance that they have trouble getting started with things. So breaking assignments into small chunks is really helpful for them. Things like, all right, maybe someone's really upset because they've got a whole page of math problems to do, but just being able to start with one and then say, good job, let's move on to the next, is really helpful for those students. And they might not know how to do that on their own yet. So you can model that, be a part of their zone of proximal development, like we talked about on Friday. And these can be really small chunks. Maybe it's not, can you do this problem on your own? Maybe it's read the problem out loud and then tell me the next step. And it's slow and it's step by step. This could also be true if you're doing lessons with a whole group. Really starting with those small chunks can be a really useful tactic. Apart from that, with students with ADHD, you are competing with the entire world around them to be the thing that they are the most interested in. So being able to incorporate their interests or real world examples into your lessons may help them to focus a little more on you and kind of get them into that like hyper-focused state. Having students repeat instructions when given, having a whole group do this, and as opposed to singling students out, can be really helpful. And we'll talk a little more about repetition as we keep going. Another thing that can be useful is giving a reward system. For students with ADHD, they often have a different, they have different motivation because of those different structures in their brain. So being able to incorporate rewards and like have them have something to look forward to can help, because they're not going to necessarily want to do something just for the sake of it. That doesn't really work for them. Apart from this, kind of goes with incorporating interests, but being enthusiastic, avoiding dead time, planning ahead so you don't have time for them to start getting distracted can help. Keeping instructions simple and structured so that there's less things to distract can help. And then these last two I think are really, really useful for all students. Start the hardest stuff when they're fresh, because they're gonna run out of steam. And if math is the most difficult subject for them, and they're waiting until the very end of the day to do it, they're gonna be exhausted and they're not gonna be able to do that challenging task. And that's when they're gonna get frustrated and give up and shut down or start acting out. And lastly, I think it's important to implement and monitor brain breaks. Does anyone know what a brain break is?
I've seen it at Barfield. So
Mhm.
like they give students like a 5-minute break just so they can so just sometimes they feel a little overwhelmed with the homework. 'Cause they're
Mhm.
literally coming from school for so many hours and then back to tutoring to do homework. So
Mhm.
um, they give the students a 5-minute break.
For sure. Yeah. 5-minute break, 2-minute break, even a 30-second, let's shake out our hands break, or a 1-minute stretch break can really make a difference. So if you're tutoring students with ADHD, they might need more frequent breaks. And maybe you can do a lot, instead of 2 long breaks, a lot of short breaks, because that's just how they're going to process things better. So I think it is important to have some structure. You don't want someone to just be able to get their breaks whenever. You want to kind of teach them to let you know when they're having some trouble, but let them have those breaks. Make that a normalized thing that students can ask for, and so on. So these are all things that are specific to students with ADHD, but they will probably help all of your students. So if you're designing for students with ADHD, you're going to help more than just them. All right. Any questions, reactions so far? Things that you want to share that have come up as we've been talking about this? All right. So let's do another 3, 2, 1 in the chat. Our next one is autism. So when you hear autism, what's the first thing you think of? Mindset of a child, differing perspectives. What else do we think of when we think of autism? Hard time understanding social settings. Let's see. Yeah, those could be some examples. Those are definitely very common. And can't express emotions correctly. I want to challenge this idea of correctly, especially when we talk about autism, and say like that you're expressing emotions differently, because there's really no correct way to express them. So we're going to think about that going in. And actually, I think that's a good place to start. So you may have noticed a lot of times a really common symbol that people use for autism, autism awareness, or those different things is a puzzle piece, because people are like, we can't understand these kids, they're too different, all of that. And it's like, oh, this is mysterious. But actually, I think a rainbow and an infinity sign is a better way to explain this. And that's actually a common symbol among autism self-advocates, because it really just shows how much diversity there is. There's infinite ways to be autistic. It's like ADHD, it's neurodevelopmental, different parts of the brain maturing at different times, which creates thinking and processing differences. And so we have a couple of different ways that we see this. We have the internal stuff, having sometimes some trouble with or differences with executive function, like we saw with ADHD, that brain management system. And then we also see sensory processing differences, experiencing the world sometimes with more intensity, sometimes with less intensity, things like sounds or textures being really difficult for someone to handle, things being louder, all of that. And same with detail processing. It might be that someone who is autistic is picking up on details really, really quickly, but not really understanding the big picture. Externally, that leads to a difference in nonverbal cues. People talk a lot about things like eye contact, and that might be because making eye contact is overstimulating for somebody who is autistic. It's not, oh, they don't want to, it's this is overwhelming. A lot of times something that people see, and they'll often mention it in the chat when we talk about this, is you know, different movement behaviors. So the most common one that people talk about a lot would be like hand flapping. And that is, there's a word for that actually, it's called stimming. And it's a way of self-regulating and just moving your body to accommodate for your environment. Stimming stands for self-stimulation, and we all do this. If you're ever like drumming on your fingers while you listen to a song or tapping your toes, that can be stimming. If you ever get so excited that you jump up and down, that could be stimming. I have this stim where, well, I fidget with a lot of things because again, neurodivergent and ADHD. But one for me is when I get my hair cut and I get it like buzzed in the back, I really, really love the feeling of the, you know, the little scritchies. And so it's like, that's a sensory thing that is really, really nice for me. And I kind of do it and I kind of fidget with it. With folks who are autistic, the stimming is going to probably be more pronounced than it is for other people. So flapping hands all the time or jumping all the time. And sometimes stimming can also be something that hurts someone. So hitting their head could be a stimming thing where they're trying to hard reset, or scratching or picking at skin. But what I really want to emphasize is that that doesn't happen for no reason. It's a form of self-regulation. And then going off of that, I think there is definitely this element of like having a hard time picking up social rules, needing to have those explained because they're not coming automatically the way that they might come automatically for neurotypical kids. And that's a lot of information all at once. So I actually want to check in with you whether any of that was new or surprising. Callan, yeah, go for it.
I just have a question in regarding to stimming is like, how are you able to properly differentiate what is an actual stimulation or just an action?
I mean, I think it kind of has to do with the environment that they're in. Like, oh, I'm noticing that this always happens when you're in a loud and crowded room, for example. So like there would be different things like that. It may not necessarily matter, and that's kind of why I use this word stimming instead of you know, being like, people with autism move differently like a lot of folks do, because it literally is a normal thing that we all do. So it may not matter like, oh, is this stimming or is this normal? It's just a word for it. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure whether I grasped all of what you were asking.
Yeah, no, that basically helped a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Basically my goal is to normalize this, and to show that we all do it. And then lastly, with autism, people talk about it a lot as a spectrum of like high functioning to low functioning, or like talk about things like mental age. But I actually think an even more useful metaphor for this is like an ice cream bar or a frozen yogurt bar. Like you go and you get your ice cream and you pick different toppings than me. Maybe I have chocolate chips and a little bit of rainbow sprinkles, and you have like so many sprinkles, and you also have strawberries, and you also have peanuts. And autism can be kind of similar person to person. Maybe somebody is just a little bit sensitive to, you know, sensory differences. But they really have trouble with social rules. They really need those explained to them, and they often hyper focus a lot. And then you go to another person and they stim all the time and they have really intense sensory processing differences, but they communicate very verbally, they're very articulate. So there's this spectrum, or there's this, I like the ice cream bar rather than the spectrum, rather than saying, oh, this person's high functioning, this person's low functioning. Everyone is a little bit different and everyone has different amounts of kind of these general traits. So how do we help our autistic students? And I use autistic because a lot of folks who are self-advocates think of this as like a part of their identity, a part of them, rather than like something separate, like it would be if you say a person with autism. So one thing you can do is be really aware of different sensory triggers and communication differences, things like, you know, monitoring noise levels and how that's going to affect your different students. And even little things like new scents, like, oh, you're wearing a perfume that, and you don't usually wear perfume, that could really affect some of your students if you have these students. And maybe in general as well. I mean, things like allergies exist. Again, we talked about this on Friday, but respect frustration signs and boundary setting, and don't push harder than you need to with students. Let them say no if they need some cool down time. Let them be by themselves. Well, not be by themselves like, oh, out of the classroom, but like if they need space, give them space. A lot of times in my experience, and I have worked with a lot of autistic students, people will be like, oh, you need to use your words or something when somebody is like saying, no, I need to stop, I need to cool down in their way. And that's a lot of times when students may lash out, or they may get frustrated, or they may, you know, reach out and hit, because they have no, like, they're trying to communicate with you and you're missing the distress signals, and then they're moving to the next step. I had that happen a lot with a student I was working with a couple of years ago. So you don't push harder than a student, you know, you don't push past that point of trust, and that's true with all of your other students as well. Like with students with ADHD, it's important to try and incorporate their interests and strengths if you can, connect it to things that they're interested in, because that'll help them to be more engaged. And like I've already said, respect movements and stimming. It's a way of self-regulating, and we all do it. Some stims can be harmful. Hitting yourself is definitely harmful. Scratching is harmful. Picking at skin is harmful. But you can't change a behavior without having alternatives. So instead of just saying, hey, don't do that, don't hit yourself, maybe create an alternative that's going to be less harmful. Like, okay, I know you want to hit your head. Next time you're really upset, I want to try something. Let's try, you know, have them slap their knee, for example. Or, okay, you're picking at your skin. Let's have you tear up a piece of paper instead. This is where that creativity gets involved in accommodations. You know, let's come up with another way to do what you need to do that's not going to harm you. Apart from that, be clear. Do not rely on tone or sarcasm to communicate your points. This is true not only for autistic students, but this would be true for young kids who don't understand sarcasm yet. It would be true for students who you're just starting to build the relationship with, because sarcasm can come across as really mean, and maybe they don't trust you yet. And it's also true for non-native English speakers. So be clear, be open. And lastly, one thing you can do is establish a reliable routine and identify like transition periods ahead of time. So give students a heads up. All right, 10 minutes, and then we're going to clean up and we're going to move to our next thing. That helps you as tutors to know what you're doing, so you're not flying by the seat of your pants. And it also helps students to know, so that you're not just surprising them and stressing them out. All right. Questions or comments or reactions on working with autistic students?
I have a comment. So
Yeah.
I do have a cousin that's autistic and he is 27, but when I said mindset of a child, he does have
Mhm.
a mindset of like a 6-year-old.
Mhm.
And just talking about like the sensory triggers and like the noise levels, he doesn't like fireworks. And I'm like, well, it's just like all makes sense. And like he doesn't like the sound of balloons like rubbing together. They
Mhm.
kind of just trigger him in a way where like he's stressed and like he will hit himself like on the head or he will slap his knee. It
Mhm.
kind of just
Mhm.
like makes, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a huge thing because like it's overwhelming. And if there are these differences in how that sensory information is being processed, like maybe fireworks are okay for you and for him it's just too much and he has to do something because it's too much. So I'm glad that that kind of resonated.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right. So let's see. I think we're going to be done by noon. I'm going to talk briefly through these last ones because I think they're not quite as common, but I do want to give them their equal attention. So mobility and access. So students could have mobility issues for multiple reasons. Could be injury, oh, I broke my ankle, or it could be a long-term disability. So if you ever have a student with a mobility aid, a cane, a wheelchair, a brace, and so on, you can't make assumptions about them and why that might be. And you also obviously don't want to like ask, oh, what happened? Because that puts them on the spot. That's not polite. It doesn't really treat them like other students. But regardless of the reason, mobility, needing to use a mobility aid or being in an inaccessible place can affect things like fatigue. Okay, it takes more energy to get place to place, so I get tired easier. Participation in activities for sure. Oh, we're doing basketball drills and I have no way to participate, and that is really hard for me and really lonely. Relationships with peers, if students are picking on them, and so on. So lots of different things. It doesn't just affect you physically. So some classroom tips, just basics for any students with limited mobility that could help all of your students would first be to minimize distances from one important point to another. Maybe that means in your space you're moving desks so that students can get over to the pencil sharpener easily. Maybe it means everyone needs to have their backpacks underneath their desks at all times, or we put our backpacks by the door. Removing those obstacles and clutter can make it easier for a wheelchair user or someone with a cane to move place to place. And you really want to do that, make it as easy on them as possible. Apart from that, making sure that your materials, your supplies and stuff are at an accessible height. Important not just for anyone with limited mobility, but also for, hey, I've got kindergartners and they can't reach up to get a pencil. You want things to be at that accessible height. Same thing would be covering sharp corners of desks if needed, so that somebody doesn't bump into them and get hurt. Like I mentioned with autistic students, plan ahead of time for lesson transitions so the student is not singled out, because it may take them longer to get cleaned up, get moving, and you don't want them to be like always the last one that everyone's waiting for so that other students single them out. So even just being able to say, all right, you got 5 minutes left, so let's do what you need to do, and then let's go to the next activity, is really, really helpful for these students. And lastly, you should probably do this in general and just know what your emergency evacuation plan is for your sites. That would be something I believe that the principal would be able to assist you with, but especially do it for these students because maybe they move a little slower. Maybe there are accommodations in place to help them, and you want to be aware of that so that you're not wondering if, gosh forbid, there's an emergency. So those would be kind of some basic tips for limited mobility students. Obviously, if they say, hey, I need this thing to be different, or a parent says they need this thing to be different, this is just like it's a non-exhaustive list, but it's a good place to start. All right, we got a couple more categories. I think we're going to be done at 12:05. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
All right, all right. I'm hoping that it is. So, chronic health conditions. I use the battery here because that's a pretty common metaphor for folks who have like a chronic condition that they experience long term, where it takes a certain amount of energy to do a certain thing, and then maybe it takes more energy, drains your battery more to do something else. When we're talking about kids, this would commonly include things like asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, and so on, but it also could include different invisible disabilities or possibly genetic disorders, and everything would be a little bit different. In general, this could cause students to miss more school, which could affect social isolation. You know, I don't get to hang out with my friends as much and I'm feeling lonely. I had to have this treatment in the hospital and it took a long time, and everyone was doing something without me. And it could also increase learning gaps, hey, I've got a lot of homework that I need to get done, and I'm really overwhelmed by that. If someone regularly takes medication or treatment, that could still have side effects. It could cause things like brain fog, anything else. So it's important to be aware of that as well, that even if a condition is well managed, there could be effects of medication and treatment. And then lastly, I really ask you to consider the impact of COVID-19 and the fact that what seems safe to some of our students might not be safe to these students if they've got any underlying conditions. So you really want to be aware of that and thinking that through. So how do we work with these students? You're going to notice a pattern because I've been talking about it the whole time. But listening to the students and parents and understanding, hey, this is what they need, is really important. And so is being mindful of triggers. You know, oh, this is what's gonna set the student off. Maybe they can't do as much physical activity. Maybe there are certain ways that you're presenting information that affect them negatively, and so on. I'm thinking about that in terms of flashing lights and epilepsy, just because that's a really common example. And then you also, again, want to be mindful of routine. If a student needs to do something every day at 3 p.m., make sure that they're able to do that, and so on. Apart from that, I think it's important to understand that conditions can change daily, to stay flexible and to create backup plans if necessary. And that's part of just what you do as a tutor. You know, you roll with the punches. You have things planned ahead of time so that if they need to change, you can do it quickly and you avoid that dead time and that confusion and all of that opportunity for kids to go do shenanigans, as we know kids do. This is one area where you want to keep records or documentation of any incidents, no matter how minor, because it could come up later. Hey, what was going on with this student? And you want to have that. You don't want to have to be like, oh shoot, let me remember what she was doing. And then lastly, ask for resources for specific cases, because advocacy groups exist for everything. So if you ever have a student and a parent is like, by the way, he has epilepsy, and you're like, I have no idea how to deal with this. One, as somebody in coaching, I am really happy to help you find resources and ways to get started. And two, you kind of want to be aware of, okay, what can I expect? A lot of times there are fact sheets for educators or for parents or how to talk to other kids. So being able to read through what do people usually suggest to do can be a good way of doing your work and making sure that that student feels comfortable and included in a lesson. I'm going a little faster because I've noticed a few times when I check, there aren't a lot of misunderstandings or questions, but anything that's coming up for you so far about mobility or chronic health
I just think that it's nice that you actually put up the spoons thing.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be kind of like the battery metaphor. One thing that's really common in a lot of chronic illness communities is using a spoons theory, which is like, instead of, oh, you have a fully charged battery and things drain the battery throughout the day, it's like, oh, you have a certain number of spoons, and different things drain different amounts of your spoons. You know, maybe taking a shower costs 3 spoons and then you only have 1 spoon left, and how are you going to spend that? I think it's important, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, just that this can be true of our tutors as well. And if they're, you know, listen to each other, be empathetic to each other, understand that these things can change daily, and believe someone if they're having trouble with something. Be creative in figuring out accommodations. If you have a tutor who has chronic pain, maybe, you know, you strategize so that tutor is sitting down and calling students to their desk, so that you can accommodate them and the whole classroom. It doesn't have to be either or, everyone's walking around, or the person sitting down and not participating. It can be both. Engaging with students and managing your condition. So yeah, let's do our last little piece. All right, so speech language impairment. This one is going to be general because this covers a huge range of conditions and disabilities. So there's language disorders, which is like I said, expressive language, understanding it or speaking it. And then there's speech disorders where there's something physically different about how you speak, things like a lisp or maybe a stutter, or physical, you know, I am having trouble holding my tongue a certain way. So stuttering could fall into both of those categories. It could also overlap with something like ADHD. It could be all kinds of, or with anxiety, it could be all sorts of different things. So it could count as a disability if it's like affecting someone substantially in their life. Speech and language impairment is not the same thing as being a non-native English speaker or an English learner, of which we have quite a few in our programs. But it can look like a lack of participation and interest, and you might have some students who are labeled that way by the school. I definitely had students when I was tutoring who were referred to me, and I would get like, you know, low motivation, no participation in school. And this could be one of those reasons. Maybe they're not speaking up in class for any number of reasons, and the administration just says, oh, the student isn't interested. But maybe it's really hard for them to express themselves. And then lastly, these students might sometimes, especially if you're talking about language disorders and comprehending language, they might respond before instructions are given. They might seem impulsive. They might have these different ways of being. So, like I said, I think this is one where you really do need specifics to understand, oh, this is what's going on. And I will gladly provide those for you if there's something you need. This is just an overview. But how do we tutor these students? Ways that help all of our students would be modeling patience and giving them time to process. Maybe making little sentence starters on index cards or popsicle sticks or something, or just alternating, okay, we're doing an activity and this part I want you to write down and this part I want you to speak. As you may have noticed, I took turns using chat versus sharing out. So that's one of those examples. Presenting one concept at a time, so there's less to process all at once. Also really helpful for some of these other groups that we've talked about. Really modeling SEL skills, like labeling your emotions, you know, hey, it sounds like, or when I would hear that, I would feel angry, or it sounds like you're feeling scared, and giving them that language so they can practice using it for themselves, because it might not come automatically. Developing nonverbal ways for students to ask for help, whether that's a raised hand, whether that's checking for understanding with a thumbs up or a sideways thumb or a thumbs down. Maybe it's the, we talked about emotion zones in our training on Friday, could be that. And lastly, have routines for students to follow. So they know what to expect. They don't have to listen for you to say it every time. They know, okay, at 4:30, we put our stuff away and we walk over, we line up for supper. The more that they know those things, the more they can expect them, the less you would have to discipline those things. Because they already know. And that also helps with security. That also helps from a trauma-informed perspective, for students to have something consistent that they can rely on and lean on. So helps with all of it. All right, going slightly faster. Our last bit is just discussing disability with students. I think it's true of all differences that are between us, that saying, oh, this is taboo, or, oh, don't talk about that, it's rude to talk about that, doesn't help with inclusion, and it doesn't help with changing people's minds. So curiosity is okay. I think it's important to focus on empathy and perspective taking. You know, well, how would you feel if somebody was asking you questions like that? And getting them to understand, oh, you know what, I'd feel embarrassed, maybe I shouldn't ask that, rather than just like, oh, don't say that, it's rude, we don't talk about it. And then this is just some general age ranges, zones of proximal development that your students might be in. From 5 to 9 years old, you can really focus on concrete thinking and facts. You know, different people, you know, people have differences in how they think or how they move, and that's okay. And thinking about it in terms of differences and similarities, having them to start processing that. And then also really establishing social norms. You know, this is how we treat each other. You know, we're always respectful, or, hey, we don't ask a question like that because that's a rude question. When it's something like, for example, when I mentioned with wheelchairs, you know, not saying to someone in a wheelchair, oh, what happened to you? This would be an age where we can kind of teach them, oh, that's not how we say that. 10 to 11 years old, they get a little more abstract, and this can be a spectrum, where some are maybe at it at 9 and some are not at it until 12 or 13. But after that, you can start discussing thoughts and feelings, and also the role of like cliques and stereotypes. You know, how do we include everyone? What does that look like? And then 12 to 18 years old, your teenagers, maybe you focus more on what is empathy and kindness, and topics around disability could become more complex. Maybe you're talking about history, maybe you're talking about accommodations, maybe you're talking about technology, in different ways. So that would be some basics on where to start. Of course, if students are, you know, not at this area, or they need more help to get to this area at 5 to 9 years old, we don't just say, oh, well, I guess they didn't get it. We work to guide them and teach them how to treat people, and to understand that people are different and all of that. So with that said, I totally lied when I said 12:05. It is now 12:10, but I just want to hear from a couple of you, wow and wonder. So a surprising moment for you, something you learned in this, and something that you're maybe still wondering about or you'd like more information on.
Can it be like any part of the training?
Yeah, sure.
I guess a surprising moment for me was back to when we were talking about FERPA,
Mhm.
and just like not taking pictures of the foster kids. I think Leslie or someone else mentioned it, but yeah, that was just surprising.
Yeah, for sure. And anything that was surprising or new for you in this training as well on disability and access?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And anything that you're still wondering about?
I guess just like, I mean, when I brought up like how like special needs kids, they tend like to hit themselves. It just like, it makes me wonder. Obviously they think differently than us in different situations, but I mean, how does that like, I don't know, how does that come to be? And I mean, you explained it, but
Gotcha. Like
it
the
just
development, like how does that happen kind of piece?
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That would be like a really, really complicated thing. And
Right.
there's a lot that goes into it.
Mhm.
In terms of, you know, reacting to stress and all of these different things, behaviors needing to be modeled. But yeah, I'm glad that you're thinking about that. That's cool. Let's see. I want to hear from a couple more people. Leslie, what was a surprising moment for you in this training?
I think for me, the different ADHDs that there are, I didn't like. Well, I knew like the one that's more the student that's more like talks out loud or does things like that. So I even have like a professor that says he has ADHD, and like a lot of people are now like saying, you know, sharing that they have ADHD, and it's like it's kind of interesting to see like the differences between like kids and adults, and just like how it's all kind of, there's different types and not just one.
Yeah. Is there anything that you're still wondering about?
Maybe just like with the other disabilities,
Mhm.
just how to go about that, how to get like information about it, how to
Yeah,
how to accommodate them in the tutoring.
for sure.
Also like can we let the other students know that this student is, you know, because I know some students get frustrated
Mhm.
with students that have disabilities. So like how do we go about that? Like, can we share that information with them, or can we just tell them to be patient with them?
That's a really good question. And that has kind of a tricky answer because on the one hand, disability, like a diagnosis is like confidential information, so you don't really want to share that, but it's something I would talk about that with the parents, and I would also talk about that with the student, and just like, hey, you know, ask the parent, hey, how do I handle this, and ask the student, you know, hey, I noticed, I'm wondering, is it okay for us to talk about this? How much, like, do you want to share? Once you've sort of built a relationship with the student, of course. And then also, if you start to notice like, hey, students are getting impatient or something, I would really reinforce the fact that your classroom is a safe place for everyone. And hey, you know, we want to be patient, and it takes people different times to do different things. So it doesn't have to be this full on educational after school special style. Well, here's all the reasons that we shouldn't judge this student, but just to remind them, hey, you know, we don't use that kind of language to talk to people, to talk with people, or in keep, or you know, hey, we're going to be patient with so and so just like we're patient with you. Those little pieces I think can help to create that more inclusive atmosphere, while you're also talking with the student and the parent and figuring out what's going to be helpful for everyone. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So just kind of being more broad, not just like pointing that student out.
Yeah.
So okay.
That goes along with this idea of universal design. You know, that's something that helps everyone.
Yeah.
Hey, reminder, we're patient with each other, because maybe that's true of other students too, even if they're not the one who's sticking out who has this disability. Cool. Any other questions or thoughts on this presentation? I know I've already taken up so much of your time, so I don't want to do that too much longer, but I do want to keep this open if you need anything. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to stop recording.